Once you've had a revolution, what do you do with it? And what does it feel like to be inside it? In 1992, Moscow flea markets overflowed with answers to these questions. A year after the Soviet Union collapsed, people sold whatever they could find in their apartments. Ration cards, war medals, old perfumes. These objects showed what Soviet life was actually like, how it fed itself, who prospered, even what an ordinary Tuesday afternoon felt like, for almost 50 years. Those afternoons unfold behind the Iron Curtain, there. Daily life took specific shapes. Hours waiting for bread and years for an apartment, yes. But also subsidizably tickets everyone could afford, and black sea vacations that factory workers took every summer. Tonight, we explore what 70 years of communism look like from the inside. We'll follow the traces left by hundreds of millions of people who lived inside a system that reinvented what it meant to be human. We'll see how they ate, worked, and loved, while history itself was being rewritten around them. By the end, you'll understand a way of life that shaped half the world. This is the story of everyday life in USSR, Chapter 1, The Great Soviet Sell-Off, Moscow. 1992, Izmailovsky Park on a Saturday morning. The frost hadn't lifted yet. Your breath hanging in the air between makeshift stalls. This flea market was the Great Soviet Sell-Off, where an entire civilization was being dismantled, one transaction at a time. Its relics spread out on folding tables and tarps on the frozen ground. The people doing the selling were unique, breed of human Homo Sovieticus. Their state had been their entire blocking out everything else. They were a people built for war and sacrifice, for a collective we that gave their lives meaning. They understood a lexicon of words like liquidate and execute. But they had no words for profit margins, no understanding of the market that had suddenly become their reality. Overnight, their world had been covered in banks and billboards. The signs Fatens promised. Our future is communist, no screamed. By now freedom, it turned out, was not an ideal. It was consumption, it was money. And so they stood here, in the cold, selling the pieces of their former lives, utterly bewildered. No one had taught them how to be free. They hadn't ever been taught how to die for freedom in a cardboard box. You could find the nation's soul, a mountain of red flags and party membership cards, and the Warmdals, an order of Lenin, the highest honor for $100, a medal for valor for 20. When someone asked the seller about his conscience, he just shrugged from inside his thin coat. Are you nuts? What rock have you been living under? These are relics from the era of totalitarianism. A former professor stood shivering, bend his life's collection of books. A former ballet dancer selling her costumes from the Kirov to soldiers with a crate of gas masks. Manufacture date 1981 by noon. The market covered several acres. Someone had set up a gramophone and was playing old Red Army choir recordings. The music drifted over the stalls. Tinyan strange in the winter air. What does it mean when a civilization's masked sacred objects end up spread on tarps in a muddy field? When a hero of socialist labor medal sits in a cardboard box next to broken watches and mismatched spoons. The sellers knew, the buyers knew, everyone knew, but nobody decided out loud. This was the real end. Not the flag coming down from the Kremlin on December 25th, but this 1,000 small Serenade Rs, all of it for sale, all of it turning into rent money, or bread money, or money for a train ticket to somewhere else. The sun never really came out that day. The market kept going until dark. Tomorrow there would be more sellers, more objects. Someone had dragged an old industrial sewing machine to sell its metal, plate stamped with Cyrillic letters and a number made in Magnith. The seller didn't know that city hadn't been Stalin's greatest construction site, built from nothing in the frozen steppe. The machine was just another heavy thing to haul home. If nobody bought, it'd be closing time. Chapter 2, Forging. Magnetogosk. 200 kilometers east of Moscow, where the Ural steppe stretches toward Asia. There's a city that shouldn't exist, Magnitogorsk, before 1929. This was empty grassland where nomads grazed their horses. The wind blew in for thousands of kilometers. Then Stalin decided to build his Pittsburgh here in the middle of nowhere. The decree came on January 17, 1929. Build the world's largest steel complex. Make more steel than Britain. Do it in 5 years. But this was more than a construction project. The entire decoders declared a heroic age. The official songs boasted about taming space and time, about becoming the young master chef. The earth, the immense hardship of the present was an acceptable, a guaranteed radiant future. Everyone was building socialism, a new world forged from steel and will. The first 256 workers arrived that March, stepping off train into a wilderness. Soon they were joined by thousands of, many were young members, the communist youth arriving with a powerful sense of mission. They saw themselves as fighters, pioneers declaring war on Russia's ancient backwardness. One young activist felt the entire country's transfer fun depended on the physical exertions of people like himself. They believed they were personally building a new civilization. Others came for different reasons. For millions of peasants fleeing the famine and chaos of collectivization, Magnitogorsk was an escape route in You could get a job, a wage, and a ration card. You could learn a trade. More than 10 million peasants moved to towns during the first 5-year plan alone. For them, the city meant a chance at education, a burning desire to study. By summer, 193,140,000 people were living there. Their steps had to be beaten down. The official newspapers said nature itself was the enemy. What the new arrivals found was chaos. John Scott, an American welder who came to help build socialism, recorded the scene. Imported American machinery sat rusting because nobody knew how to operate it. Workers mixed concrete by hand. The workforce was Severian. Stalin's revolution had churned up. Enthusiastic volunteers worked alongside deported kulaks. Common criminals shared barracks with political prisoners. 40 different nationalities were thrown together. You could hear Russian, Tatar, Kazakh, and Ukrainian at the worksite. Work orders often got lost in translation, yet something extraordinary happened in this chaos. An illiterate Tatar woman learned to operate a blast furnace. A peasant's son became a red director running the entire complex. This was the promise fulfilled. The 1930s were an age of opportunity for ambitious people from that background. The government actively promoted workers and peasants into higher education, creating a new elite of engineers and managers. They felt they were the young master sand. They thanked the revolution for the chance. Life found a way. Workers planted potos in the dirt between construction sites. Informal settlements sprang up, nicknamed Shanghai for their shackle appearance. In the evenings, someone might play a harmonica in fabrics. the sound thin against the vastness of the steppe. On Sundays, there were football matches on packed earth. People fell in love, got married, had children, all in the shadow of the blast furnace that never stopped burning. Day or night, the steel from Magnitogorsk financed everything else Stalin wanted to build. It paid for the Moscow metro, the Dniprodom, the White Sea Canal. Today, Magnitogorsk still stands, still produces steel. The air tastes sulfur and metal. The snow falls grey from the factory smoke. The city that shouldn't exist remains a monument to a particular kind of human will. The pyramids of Egypt took decades, Magnitogorsk 5 years. Both were built with a mix of raw belief and brutal force meant to last forever. And while the furnace burned, turning ore into metal, this Soviet state was crafting a new kind of freedom, forged in the same fire of ideology. Chapter 3. Designing the Dream. 1930 to 1941. The Soviet Union published the most beautiful magazine ever created. USSR in construction came out monthly in English, German, and French. Thick paper, gorgeous photography, innovative design. It was a vision of a future you could hold in your hands, a tactile piece of the coming paradise. Foreign intellectuals collected the displayed them in their studies as proof that something wonderful was happening in the East. The photographer, Alexander Rushin, shaped its visual language. He believed you could revolutionism and consciousness by revolutionize how people see, photograph ordinary objects from unexpected angles, make the familiar strange, force the eye to work differently. A smokestack shot from directly below becomes a geometric abstraction. Workers on scaffolding turn into diagonal lines cutting across the sky. We must discover the visible world, Hess. We must revolutionize our visual thinking. This new way of seeing had a name: socialist realism. The magazine taught its readers to see life not as it was but as it was becoming. An empty, muddy ditch was a future canal. A vacant lot filled with rubbish was a future park. The magazine pioneered matic photo essays where images flowed into each other, creating movement in the static page. Here is a wooden plow from 1860. Turn the page. A field of tractor stretching to the horizon. The message was simple. The past is primitive. The future has already arrived. You just have to learn how to see it. This was an aspirational reality, a promise that made the grim present feel temporary. People learned to live in a state of becoming. The memoirist Risa Oliver recalled that her grim communal apartment was just a preparation. Life, properly speaking, would begin later in a new and sparkling White House. The feeling was faster toward the great goal, and there everything would begin in a jet. The magazine was the blueprint for that sparkling house, the map toward great goal. The visual language drew from Antonia Rath's Vienna method of picture. Neurath had visited Moscow, advised the Soviet USSR Institute. His idea was that pictures could convey complex information to illiterate. The Soviets took this further. They made statistics emotional. A graph of rising wheat production became a golden wave sweeping across the page. Coal output statistics transformed into mountains of black diamonds. Artists like L. Lisitsky designed Antiris. His work on the Dnieper hydroelectric station used photomontage to make the dam into abstract art and the workers into heroes. And many people, especially young, genuinely believed they were those heroes. The generation of the 1930s saw themselves as participants in our historic process. They eagerly went, AFA's pioneers, to distant construction sites like Magnitogorsk, building a steel city on the empty steppe, because they believed they were building a new world. This heroic tension, an activist from the era recalled, was an excuse for all the difficulties. But how did they reconcile these glossy images with the shortages, the fear, and the drabness of daily life? They lived a double life. In the privacy of their kitchens at night, they criticized their government and told bitter jokes. In feminine, they walked out the door and transformed into average Sovietizings, slaving away for the regime. It was a necessary performance. They also held on to the promise that their hardship was a noble sacrifice. We believed that tomorrow would be better than today, one witness recalled. We heard a future. The magazine stopped publishing when Germany invaded in 1941. The printing presses that had produced those gorgeous photo essays were Retoletto print ration cards. The photographer who shot carefully composed images of Soviet paradise were now documenting mass graves. Yet the vision they had crafted did its work. It convinced civilians, both at home and abroad, that experiment was succeeding. Even now in museums and private collections, those magazines still seduce. They are the beautiful ghosts of a future fatally partially existed. A dream whose full, shocking cost would only be told when the archives were finally opened. Decades later, Chapter 4. The Kommunalka during the industrialization drive of 1930s. More than 10 million peasants flooded into Soviet cities. The housing crisis was catastrophic. The state had one solution: the kommunalka, the communal apartment. Takia pre-revolutionary apartment built for own wealthy family, divided between 8. One room per family. Everyone shares the kitchen and bathroom. By 1960, more than half of Moscow lived this way. 25 million families across the USSR. Ilya Kabakov mapped how these spaces changed after the revolution. His building once had sitting rooms, studies, servants' quarters, nor serious with painted walls. After 1917, the state put up partitions, thin walls that didn't reach the ceiling. The former library housed the Petrovs and their 2 children. The old master bedroom held a war widow and her mother. The kitchen was the main battlefield. 8 families, 8 tiny tables, each owned defended with absolute determination. Touch someone else's salt shaker, and dude hear about it for months. Private property was jealously guarded. Pots, pans, even personal toilet seats that hung on hooks in the bathroom. You'd carry yours in, use it, carry it back out. Some families had padded seats. Others used bare wood worn smooth. Since 1928, the ethnologist Ilya Utikon studied how people navigated this world. They weren't just passive victims enduring struggle. They were active agents using whatever tools they had. The most precious commodity was square meters, overflowing space. Resentment over space could spark fights that lasted decades. Not just shouting matches, lawsuits, denunciations. Local authorities report your neighbor for an anti-seat joke. Maybe get their room. During the purges of 1937, this system turned lethal. A hostile neighbor could destroy you. They'd file complaints that could get you disfranchised, refused a passport, arrested. Even in calmer times, any argument about noisier cooking smells might escalate to Zomian calling the building committee. The kommunalka was a functioning social system. brutal but complex. Yet it wasn't all warfare. Apartments also often functioned as networks of mutual support. Neighbors who nursed each other through illness, watched each other's children. Residents often left their doors unlocked, helped each other out. When the wife of an enemy of Thepipol needed shelter. Sometimes Nagors looked the other way. Children often had different memories. They found playmates in the corridors. The kommunala was their They could observe 8 different varieties of adult behavior bear breakfast. Less developed instincts for private property meant these saw opportunity where adults. For them, the endless drama could be entertainment. Joseph Brodsky remembered the sensory overload. Mornings when everyone needed the stove at once. Metal on metal, water boiling, oil spitting. The smells that told you everything about your neighbors. Cabbage soup on Monday, fish on Friday. The Armenian family's kafethat made everyone else jealous. The corridors had their own weather. In winter you could see your breath in Thaleway. In summer, the smell of 8 families, sweat and cooking fat hung in the air. People developed ways to move through these spaces without touching, without making eye contact. A domestic choreography born from too many people line to little space. Kabakov called it a daily domestic penal colony. But that misses soon. Yes, there were wars over Hubert's toilet paper last. Someone used too much hot water. Someone's guests stayed too long in the bathroom. Boothus was also a machine for producing a particular kind of person. Someone who could endure anything. Someone who could carve out a life in impossible circumstances. By 1989, a quarter of Leningrad still lived this way. Millions who'd grown up with Savenova families, knowing their every secret. The kommunala was Soviet society in miniature. All its conflicts, accommodations, and survival strategies compressed into a few shared rooms. And if the kommunala taught patience through forced intimacy, the Soviet K taught it through endless waiting, where entire days could disappear into the simple act of waiting for bread. Chapter 5. The Q. From the early 1930s. Life revolved around an endless, grinding struggle for the basics. Chronic shortages of food, clothing, and soap were a central fact of existence. The state's answer to this was the Q. The historian Yelena Sokina wrote that the Soviet line Medieval right alongside the Soviet social order. It was everywhere, a permanent feature of the landscape. Edged onto the cities like a scar, the experience was often desperate. During the worst shortages, like the winter of 1936, people waited in line for bread from 2 o'clock in the morning. Thousands of Azents slept on the frozen ground outside bakeries. Letters to newspapers described the noise, the shouting, the fights, the curses aimed at Soviet. One report told of people freezing to death on the journey home. The bread they had waited all night forklitched in their hands. This line was a distinct social space with its own culture and its own unwritten laws. It even had a specific vocabulary. You never asked, what are Rethi selling? You asked, what are they giving out? This acknowledged the reality of state distribution. Goods that were hard to get were known by a single term, deficit goods. The first rule understood by everyone was to join the line. You saw immediately. Only after you had secured your place did you ask what it was for. Shopping became a survival skill. A new species emerged, Homo sovieticus, whose most developed talents involved the hunting and gathering of scarce goods in an urban environment. This required constant vigilance and ferret tools. Every citizen carried a string bag and a vodka tucked away in a pot. The name meant just in case. Yo had to be ready for the off chance. Yo stumbled upon something worth having. The Q was also a hub of information. It was the nation's unofficial public square. With hundreds of frustrate pull, forced together for hours, they started talking. They exchanged rumors, they shared news, they complained. The secret police knew this was dangerous. They planted informers in the long jescus to record the conversations, listening for any curses directed at the state or its leader. The Q was where official promises were measured against harsh reality of an empty bag. There was, however, one strategy that trumped all others. The most important survival skill was knowing how to avoid Q altogether. An entirely alternative system existed, a world of personal connections and reciprocal favors known as blat. The public's access to goods was sound reliable that a whole vocabulary emerged to describe getting things on the left or under the counter. A popular proverb captured the entire philosophy. One must have not 100 rubles but 100 friends. Blat was a network of relationships, a system of favors among gokuls that participants saw as simple friendship. Having a connection with a store manager or a warehouse worker was more valuable than a wallet full of cash. These contacts could give you advanced warning when a shipment after facet goods was due. They might let you in through the back door. The satirical journal Crocodile once ran a cartoon of a store manager who only sold to customers he knew by name. The caption read, "If he doesn't know Samin, he doesn't sell to them." For those without the right friends, there was only the line. The average Soviet woman spent 2 hours a day. That adds up to 9 full working weeks a year just standing, waiting, hoping something would be left when yo finally reached the counter. It was time made visible, a lifetime spent in anticipation, and while millions stood waiting for the base, the state was designing grand monumental spaces where this natural patience could be transformed into public spectacle. Chapter 6. A Garden for the New Human Being. In 1935, a new slogan appeared from Stalin. Life has become better, comrades. Life has become more cheerful. This marked a major shift, a turn away from the aestheticism of the early revolution. Historians call it the Great Retreat. The state began to foster a new tolerance for people enjoying themselves, actively encouraging mass leisure activities like carnivals, dancing, and even jazz. The prototype for this new vision was a park built on site of Moscow's old municipal dump, Gorky Park. Its purpose was to offer a new kind of cultured leisure to the masses. It was an education in cult. In the 1930s, culture was seen as something that had to be mastered. It was the complex of behaviors, attitudes, and knowledge that separated cultured people from those considered backward. Its value was self-evident, and for millions, the desire for it was immense. This hunger for self-improvement was real. One woman of peasant background remembered arriving in Moscow with a burning desire to study, saying where or what wasn't important. He wanted to study. A popular saying, put it more bluntly, without that piece of paper, the diploma, you are an insect. With it, a human being. In a 1937 survey, nearly half the young workers at the Stalin auto plant said their main goal was to continue their education, Kolnistad levels. The most basic was hygiene, washing with soap, cleaning your teeth, not spitting on the floor. The next step was mastering urban behavior, using a knife and fork, sleeping on sheets, wearing underwear, and not getting so drunk you missed work. For the new light, it meant correct speech and an appreciation for ballet. The magazine Agon ran a quiz. Are you a culture-ed person? Readers were expected to know 5 plays by Shakespeare, 5 makes of Soviet automobile, 4 rivers in Africa, and the names of Sivan Stakhanovites. Gorky Park was the laboratory where Althus was taught. It was a mix of education and entertainment. It had Ferris wheels, bowling alleys, dance floors, and cinemas. It even had recreational parachute jumping towers. At the opening of the winter season in 1935, Stalin's life has become more cheerful. Legend was draped in a banner over the main gates. A carnival of happy youth that same year saw 3,000 young people parade through the grounds. The American ambassador, Joseph Davis, saw a sports parade there in July 1937. He described 50,000 young people, Tanadand, beautiful in a 4-hour procession. There were gymnasts performing on moving floats, acrobats doing somersaults, and 1,500 young men skiing over the asphalt in skis fitted with ball bearings. He called it one of the most beautiful and extraordinary exhibitions he had ever seen. This was July 1937, the height of the Great Terror. While Davies watched teenagers doing backflips, the secret police were conducting mass arrests across the city. The park created its own reality, a performance of socialist joy. Just a few kilometers from the torture chambers of the Lubyan, it was a space where the state's vision of happiness met the people's genuine need for rest and self-improvement. Both were happening at once in the shadow of unimaginable darkness. Botha's public world of organized leisure had its counterpart in the anticipatory world of the home. Chapter 7. Education and upward mobility. Across the Soviet Union in the 1930s, a social earthquake was underway, 8-4 level in every corner of the vast country. People were changing their status. Peasants were leaving their village for the first time, moving to town and becoming industrial workers. Workers were moving off the factory floor into technical jobs or becoming party officials. The change was so common, so expected that the standard trade union personnel questionnaire drawed a line for it. Year of moving out of production or quitting agriculture. It was simply assumed that you had this immense churn was the result of a deliberate state project. A rapidly expanding economy created a desperate need for new jobs for managers, engineers, and party secretaries. The government responded with a policy of aggressive, affirmative action. Khalid Vidviani, Stalin, himself initiated a major program for sending promising workers, young communists, and peasants to higher education. He was building a new society and needed a new ruling class loyal tough system that had created them from scratch for millions. The key that unlocked this new world was education. A burning desire to study became a defining feature of the generation. One woman born to a peasant family recalled the feeling vividly, where or what wasn't important. I wanted to study, she said, understanding that learning was ticket to a different life. A popular saying captured this belief with brutal clarity. Without that piece of a paper, you are an insect. With it, a human being. At the Stalin auto plant in 1937, a survey of young workers found that nearly half of them stated that continuing. My education was their main personal goal. The state constructed an entire new infrastructure to meet this demand. It was a multi-track system for advance. There were special networks of party schools and preparatory schools, known as Rabfak, designed to bring workers up to academic speed. Industrialists, the one attended by a young Nikita Khrushchev, were created to turn Minasinto managers. The expansion of the formal education system was explosive. In the single decade after 1928, the number of children in school almost tripled, while the number in secondary schools ballooned by 6 times. This project produced countless real-life success stories, Cinderella-like ascents from the humblest position, tough heights. Georgi Alexandro, the son of a worker, was a homeless child before being taken into a He was trained as a metal worker, kept studying, and eventually a professor and head of propaganda for the Central Committee. Sergei Kofanov worked in a mine as a teenager and made his way through the Komsomol and a trade school to the Mandelf Chemical Institute. Later Beckerman, first deputy minister for culture. Roman Bannon and Victor Thesons, of a poor peasant and a cooper, rose to become the directors of the massive industrial plants at Zaporozhye Steel and the Pilov Works. This entire cohort formed the core of Soviet leadership for decades to come. They were the Brev generation, Leonid Brev and most of his long-serving Paul Bureau in the 1970s and 1980s were beneficiaries of this vast affirmative action project. They were, and they felt themselves to be, the young masters of the Soviet Union. They were profoundly to Stalin and the revolution for the chances they had been given. The experience created a deep psychological bond between those who were promoted and the system that promoted them. They felt an immense pride in their journey. The memoir of Fedorovna, a Melina who became a Facto's technical director, is a classic example. She celebrated her own long road from Filitaritjanka to a cultured Soviet woman. This was more than a career. It was a fundamental transformation of the self. They saw their success in ideological terms as a collective victory. The famous tractor driver, Pasha Angelina, explained this perfectly, contrasting our own story with that of a Western press baron. She wrote that while Frusterna rose from the people, I rose together with the people. This conviction that their individual success was just one part of a shared history was a crucial element of their identity and their unwavering loyalty. The memory of this time when a path was open for the little man lingered for many years. An interviewee in the 1990 shreckled the Soviet street names with a specific pride: Metallurgists Avenue, Enthusiasts Avenue, Factory Street. The little man was the most important on it. Another voice full of Lars looked back on that era under socialism. She said, I was promised that there was a place in the sun for everyone. Chapter 8. The Wives' Movement in the New Industrial Towns of the 1930s. Life for the wives of the Soviet elite could be a vacuum. Their husbands were building a new world, absorbed bed complete by the factory, the plan, endless meetings. The women were often left behind in new settlements that were little more than construction sites in the middle of nowhere. There were few amenities. One wife wrote of the sheer emptiness of days where the only events were a trip to the hairdresser or another party with the same guests and nothing new to discuss. It was a profound isolation, a social and intellectual gulf that separated them not just from the new Soviet society, but from their own husbands, an engineer's wife. Raised in the revolutionary intelligentsia, remembered the alienation keenly. The more time her husband spent at Thepland, the greater the distance between them grew. He had new acquaintances, new industrial administrators and party workers. She found it was not enough simply to make conversation. One had to know what to talk about. In a society that sanctified labor, buying just a housewife was a source of shame. These women were officially classified as part of the unorganized population. One complained that she felt they were not even considered fully human. Thelabel was a constant, irritating reminder of their peripheral status. Then a movement appeared that felt like a godsend. It was called the Objestvenetzer movement, named after its journal, which meant woman activist. It originated in heavy industry under the direct patronage of Sergio or Johnny Kidzi, the powerful minister of heavy industry. The official launch came in May 1936 at a grand conference in the Kremlin. Fourth wives of managers and engineers attended by Stalin himself. The movement offered these women a way to connect at the pass. A bridge into the new society it had seemed to exclude them. The founding myth was simple and effective. Odin kids on a tour of a plant was said to have been inspired by a public square that had been single-handedly beautified by Vesarova, a manager's wife who had filled it with flowers and bushes. This story captured the movement's spirit. Its great discovery was its organizing. Women were organized not by their neighborhood, but through their husband's workplace. This structure inherently mirrored the at any local branch. The enterprise director's wife was Usualath, one who took the lead. This was explicitly a form of organization for elite wives, not for ordinary working women. Even when the wives of high-performing Stakhanovit workers were later included, it did little to change the movement's upper-class character or how it was perceived. This could create friction. At one factory, workers complained that the managers' wives were only interested in jetting themselves, honors and publicity. They accused them of exploiting workers to create elaborate gifts for political leaders. The movement was a solution for some, but a source of resentment for others. The core mission of the wives was to bring culture, a sense of cultured living, to their new communities. They embarked on a vast range of civic improvement projects. They planted tens of thousands of trees and flower beds. The wives of Komandasov, the Amur River Fleet, reportedly dug 68,000 flower beds and planted 70,000 trees. They sewed countless table napkins, rugs, curtains, and lampshadesto adorned the stark Red Army barracks, trying to turn sterile spaces into something resembling a home. They took on the grim task of improving workers' housing, furnishing dreary dormitories and barracks. They organized residential services, setting up kindergartens, nurseries, and holiday camps for children. They established military schools, libraries, and public baths. They even began supervising the quality of food served in factory cafes, extending their domestic concerns into the public sphere. Alongside these community projects, they also worked to improve their own lives. In the industrial city of Magnitogorsk, the wives set up a cultured cafe in Thelakul Theatre. At other plants, they established fashion atsum, catering exclusively to elite women with dresses costing as much as 100 rubles initially. The movement's ideology centered on domesticity. The main theme was the wife's obligation to create a comfortable, well-ordered home life for her important, hard-working husband. The ideal was a professor's wife who, despite her own volunteer work, always ensured her husband returned to a welcoming home of exemplary order and warm, feminine comfort. But this ideal was not accepted by everyone. The journal, Obsessed Venets, published a letter from an engineer's wife who felt she was wasting her education, being left out of all the exciting things happening in the country. The letter sparked a fierce debate. Some readers responded with sharp criticism for her husband, comparing him to an old country nobleman who needed a serf to scratch his heels before he could sleep. As the 1930s wore on and the threat of war loomed, the focus of the movement began to shift. Women were encouraged to learn traditionally male skills. They learned to shoot, drive a truck, and fly planes. The journal began to frame the movement as a preparatory stage, a stepping stone for wives who were bound for further education or promotion in work. The ultimate symbol of Thistron's formation was the movement's founder Klavdia Surova. After gaining prominence through hacktivism, she made a decisive break. She left her husband, moved to Moscow, and enrolled in the prestigious Stalin Industrial Academy. There, she remarried a fellow student. She declared that her college transcript was her new passport. It was her passport to a new life. Chapter 9. The Soviet Body. The French writer André Gide stood on the Mausoleum Tribune in 1936, watching the annual fiscal tour parade. He later confessed, "I had never imagined so magnificent a sight. This perfect forms had evidently been trained, prepared, selected. But how can one fail to admire a country and a regime capable of producing them?" Every year on Red Square, tens of thousands of Soviet bodies moved in perfect synchronization. The American ambassador, Joseph Davies, watched the 1937 parade and could barely contain his amazement. It was Flaminius, and a very beautiful youth. It was all bareheaded and tanned to a deep brown, for the most part wearing only white shorts and colored jerseys. The combinations of blues and whites, reds and whites, oranges and whites made a beautiful display. There were skiers actually skiing in companies of 1,500 young men. They apparently had ball bearings on their skis to enable them to get over the asphalt. On some floats were the horizontal bars with their gymnasts, actually performing and springboards with acrobats, doing double high somersaults on the float. All in all, it was one of the most beautiful and extraordinary exhibitions I have ever seen. The fiscular movement began during the Civil War. May 25, 1919, the first parade was organized by the Universal Military Training Organization, preparing raw recruits for the Red Army. From the beginning, physical culture meant military readiness. By 1931, this became official with the Gator program, ready for labor and defense. Millions of citizens were tested to meet physical standards. How many pull-ups could you do? How fast could you run a kilometer? Your GTO badge proved you were ready to defend socialism. Yet, alongside the state's demand for military preparedness, a parallel movement was happening inside the people's homes and minds. It was a widespread popular aspiration to become ochered or culture. A clean, disciplined, healthy body was seen as the very foundation of the modern Soviet person. A clear break from a backward past. This project of Colorus started with the basics: washing with soap, cleaning your teeth, not spitting on the floor. For the new elite, physical self-care was a requirement of their status. The industrial leader or journey instructed his managers to a model manager began every day with gymnastics at 6:15. Soviet sport positioned itself against Western athletics. The Olympics celebrated individual achievement, breaking records, personal glory. The Soviets promoted mass collective expressions. Instead of sending athletes to the Amsterdam Olympics in 1928, they held the Spartakiad, named after their bell slave. It was a festival of international proletarian solidarity, synchronized movement. This collective energy spilled out from the stadiums and into everyday life with agnoon popular enthusiasm. Parachute jumping became a national craze, an activity that turned up even. It was not just a military. The state set up recreational pratchak, jumping towers in parks, culture, and rest for ordinary citizen Stoyus. The sports symbolized Soviet daring and a new mastery of the air. The popularity of football soared in the 1930s, supported by new stadiums and generous state funding. The entire movement seemed to have a soundtrack in famous Sportsman's March with its celebratory, roaring lyric Fiscal Ura, Aurora. Artists created a new pantheon of athletic heroes. Alexander Samag, Valovainted girl wearing a football jersey in 1932. She became the icon of the new Soviet woman. Strong shoulders, a confident gaze, ready for work or sport or war. Modern icons celebrated the Fiskulanitsa, whose very image, replacing Thasans of yesteryear, was designed to inspire devotion. You would see her everywhere, in manners as sculptors, in the Moscow metro, on propaganda posters, in every factory, Vera Mukina's, massive worker and Kolkos woman. Statue at the Paris World Fair. Their bodies perfect, powerful, invincible. The paradox was timing. The celebration of perfect bodies peaked during the Great Terror. While those beautiful youth performed on Red Square in July 1937, the NKVD was conducting mass arrests across Moscow. The same year, Stalin held a football match staged on Red Square for his personal entertainment. They covered the square with green carpet. Dynamo Moscow. The NKVD team played Spartak Moscow. Everyone involved in organizing it would later disappear. Alexander Kozyrev, head of the Komsol, who initiated the game shot. Nikolay Starstin, Spartak's trainer, sent to the Gulag. The generation trained in those tanned and perfect youth Davies admired would soon face the German invasion. Their athletic bodies would freeze in the trenches outside They would starve during the siege of Leningrad, would burn in tanks at Kursk. The culture that was supposed to create invincible defenders, people who died by the millions. Their gymnastics training, no protection against artillery shells. Yet, the movement did transform It changed how people thought about their bodies. Exercise became moral duty. Health became political responsibility. Millions moved in unison to the morning Kalishniks on the radio. Factory workers took gymnastics breaks. Swimming pools were built even inside parks filled with pull-up bars where young men gathered after work. Thebedy became another space where the state and the individual met, negotiated, and struggled. It was a site of genuine aspiration and pride, but also of ultimate service. The Komaloth was clear. I am prepared to give up me life if my nation should need it. As people insisted decades later. These weren't just words. Chapter 10. Descent of an Empire. 'Twas for generations. Kresnaya Moskva was the scent of Soviet celebration. Red Moscow, the perfume came in a crystal flask packed in a bright red box. You'd smell it at the theater, at weddings. An International Women's Day, in a world where luxury barely existed. This fragrance meant something special. Washaponing. The story begins in 1913. The Moscow firm Brocard Company created a perfume called the Empress's Favorite Bouquet to celebrate 300 years of the Romanov dynasty. After the revolution, this single formula split into Ernest B., who'd worked for the competing firm, a Ritlet company, Escopeto Paris, with the formula. He presented variants to Coco Chanel. She chose the fifth one. Chanel No. 5 was born. Meanwhile, Auguste Michel, a French perfumer at Brocard, couldn't leave Russia. His passport had gone missing. Inth revolutionary bureaucracy. The brocade factory was nationalized, renamed Novozaria New Dawn. In 1925, Michel adapted the Empress's favorite bouquet for Soviet production. The new perfume launched in 1927 for the 10th anniversary of the October Revolution. They called it Krasnaya Moskva. The same czarist formula now served capitalist luxury in Paris, socialist prestige in Moscow. Initially, the Soviet state condemned the perfume as bourgeois decadence. A 1924 article in Robotnitsa, through Working Woman magazine, declared that cosmetics will be liquidated by synth. Cultural level of women in the COMMUN, wearing perfume was an act of revocation. The constant mixing of Greek fragrances with the smell of cabbage soup or roast onions does not simply degrade a scent and turn it into something disagreeable and intrusive. It falsifies the very meaning of perfume Asa concept. The secret pleasure a woman takes in her perfume became fragile and wise, swiftly terminated once she found herself criticized as petty bourgeois or oppressed by the grinding hardships of daily life. By the mid-30s, everything changed. The new Stalinist elite wanted their own version of the good life. Polina Shemchuina, wife of Foreign Minister Molotov, ran the Tia Cosmetics Trust. She promoted Soviet perfume production as politically necessary. Kulnost means smelling good. The state that had condemned perfume now manufactured it by the tongue. Krasnaya Mova became the scent of the Norman Clara. Film stars like Lyubov Orlova wore it. The perfume counter at the Hotel Moskva store sold it to party officials' wives. The perfumer Rudolf Friedman described its character in 1955, associated with elegant warmth, playful and flirtatious languor, melodious plastic harmony. Another analysis found it had an astounding combination, affragor and sexuality, tenderness and firmness. Over 60 ingredients, creating something complex, contradictory, perfectly Soviet. After the war, Soviet perfume production expanded. By the 60s, Krasnaya Moskva seemed old-fashioned. Young people wanted fragrances from Poland or East Germany. When Western brands flooded in, Dior, Gucci, Chanel itself, the factory that produced Krasnaya Mova was privatized, struggled, nearly disappeared. Today you can still buy Krasnaya Mova, though the formula has changed. The factory claims it's the same, but perfumers say the expensive ingredients were replaced long ago. The crystal bottle became glass. The red box became cardboard. What remains is the memory of that scent. Women in their 80s still recognize it immediately. It takes them back to their youth, to dancing at the Palace of Culture, to their first kiss in Gorky Park. The perfume that was born from empire, survived revolution, and defined an era now sits on dusty shelves in Moscow gift shops. Tourists buy it as a curiosity, the scent of an empire that tried to make everything but couldn't escape the fact that Tevin, its fragrances had aristocratically. Some escapes from the past were more brutal than others. Chapter 11. The tyranny of the cold Kalima stretches across the Siberian larger than Western Europe. They called it the Pole of Cold. During the first 5-year plans, the Soviet state operated under immense pressure to industrialize at an impossible speed, viewing it as a matter of national survival. To finance this, the Dolroy Trust was established to exploit Kayat's vast resources of gold and uranium, using the labor of the Gulag system to meet its quotas. In this brutal equation of resource extraction against the Human lives were subordinated to industrial targets. Genya Ginsburg spent years in coma. She wrote about the thermometer hanging outside the guard hut. -49°C was the worst possible reading of albacores. The official humanity of the medical regulations could come into operation only when the thermometer read 50, -50, meant that the administration could cancel work in the forest that day. 1 degree separated a day of brutal labor from staying in the ice. Every morning began with prisoners staring at that thermometer, hoping for that single degree of mercy. Valim Shalamov knew the cold intimately. He didn't need a thermometer. If there was a frosty mist, then it was 40 centigrade outside. If there was a noise when you breathed out, but you could still breathe normally, then it was -45. If your breath was noisy and you were out of breath, then it was -50, below 55. A gob of spit freezes solid in mid-air. Spit had been freezing in mid-air for 2 weeks. The cold shaped everything. Shalamov wrote that the same cold that turned saliva to ice in mid-air had gotten to the human soul. You couldn't think about anything in the freezing cold. Everything was simple. The cold, hungry brain couldn't take in nutrition. Their brain cells withered. That was Wuther panned to the soul. It froze, it shrank, and maybe it would stay cold forever. The official ideology of the camps was Reforging. Reforging. This was the belief that corrective labor could transform criminals and political opponents into productive Soviet citizens. However, in the extreme conditions of Kaima, where production quotas consistently overrode concerns for human welfare, this ideologicalpias disintegrated. The reality foremost was not reforging but a desperate battle against starvation and the elements. Shalom worked as a medical orderly documenting phages of this decline: scurvy, pelagrath, and elementary dystrophy. The final stage they called doyagana. Shalamov calculated the mathematics of destruction to turn a healthy young Manwo had begun his career in the clean winter air of the gold mines into Oganor. All that was needed at a conservative estimate was a term of 20 to 30 days, of 16 hours of work per day with no rest days, with systematic starvation, torn clothes and nights spent in temperatures of -60 in a canvas tent with holes in it, and bung beaten by the foreman. The gold mines consumed work brigadesque and play. They'd be replaced several times in a single season. The dead weren't buried in the permafrost, too hard to dig. Bodies piled up waiting for spring when meltwater would wash them away. Shalom wrote that a gold miner constantly discards its production refuse into the hospitals, the so-called convalescent teams, invalid settlements and mass graves. For Shalamov, the body itself became a testimony. He wrote about resurging his material with his own hide, not only with his heart, but with every pore of his skin, his every nerve. His Kalamaglov was his worker's hand, permanent libent into the shape of a shovel handle. Frostbite, scars, skin that peeled from scurvy became Waith called a living exhibit for the Museum of Local History. The gold extracted from the permafrost at such a high human cost entered thirties of the Soviet economy. It paid for imported factory equipment and funded monumental projects like Dnepr Dam and the Moscow Metro, symbol SEF, a new industrial future. Kolma thus represents a central paradox of the era: the construction of a modern state through the simultaneous destruction of its own people. While Moscow celebrate industrial triumphs, the permafrost reserved the evidence of their cost, holding its victims in the same cold that killed them. Chapter 12: The Paradox of Soviet Ballet, Russian ballet survived everything: revolution, civil war, terror, World War. Before 1917, it led Europe. Marius Petipa choreographing in St. Petersburg. Anna Pavlova and Voslav Nijinsky dancing in the world's stages. After their evolution, many fled west. Sergei Diaghilev's ballet. Russia's became the center of modernism in Paris, uniting Stravinsky's music, Picasso's designs, Bax's costumes. Yet the Bolshoi in Moscow and the Kirov in Leningrad and State-up supported, meticulously. They became the Soviet Union's premier cultural export. From this world came Rudolf Nerv. His refusal to board a Moscow-bound flight at Labouge Airport on April 17, 1962, became a Cold War sensation. He launched Shedinto fame. 300 performances a year from London to Tokyo. Open about his homosexuality, extravagant in his lifestyle, rebellious in his behavior. Critics called him the Hirta Nijinsky. They praised his magical agility, his wild leaps, his fierce discipline. At the end of every performance, he'd bow with hand outstretched, a gesture of what seemed like natural grace. That grace was forged in the Kirov school through years of almost mathematical training. The Vaganova choreographic school, Shapitny Rev, Vera Kostrovitskaya's textbook school of classical dance, reveals the science behind Soviet ballet. Every movement dissected, codified, grounded in anatomical logic. She explains a plumb perfect stability. The basis of stability lies in the preservation of the vertical axis, which passes through the middle of the head and body to the ball of the supporting foot. To obtain stability in those cases where a bend of the body to the side or back or an inclination forward is required, the center weight must be over the supporting leg through which passes the vertical axis of the body. This rigorous method demanded total physical and mental discipline. The body became a perfectly calibrated instrument. Nerv's path was unlikely. Born in 1938 on a Trans-Siberian train tow, a Tatar Bashkir family, grew up in provincial Ufa. A local teacher trained in Imperial Street Petersburg noticed his talent. At 17, late for a ballet student, he entered the Kirov school. Founded in 1738, steeped in 2 centuries of tradition, Leningrad itself was his education. The city of palaces and museums, where the intelligentsia had survived revolution and siege, preserving their reverence for high culture. His teacher, Alexander Pushkin, carried the direct lineage of classical tradition. Joseph Brodsky scribed this milieu, this world that gave Nureyev what his biographers called his stature, his power and his self-confidence. The tradition survived because Ofogrina Vaganova, born 1879, graduated from the Imperial Ballet School. When others fled after their evolution, she stayed and taught. Shep produced the first generation of great Soviet ballerinas, including Galina Olenova. Vaganova dismissed the avant-garde exponents of the 20s as destructive aberration. When Stalin's cultural policy shifted toward classical forms in the 30s, her approach triumphed. Appointed artistic director of Thekharov in 1931, she made it her mission to preserve and revive ballets of classical heritage. Her textbook became Soviet Ballettsbobel. The Kirov became increasingly expensive. By the late 50s, when Dethor exposed Soviet artists to Western influence, the theater felt like a museum. Nureyev hungered for modern choreographers like George Balanchine-Wauer, evolving the art form. The Kirov's restrictive repertoire and constant surveillance by officials made him feel trapped. His defection was artistic. He needed to engage with ballet's futuretto, proved that true grace couldn't be confined by borders. Maya Plazhetskaya, another great Soviet dancer, lost her father to Stalin's terror in the same sweet Stalinist manner. The ballet world had its victims during the purges, yet it remained a protected space of artistic cells. The state that destroyed so many artists also preserved this honor tradition with obsessive care. The dancers trained to leap and spin with perfect control lived in a country where every other movement was watched, and the contradiction was breathtaking. Chapter 13. The Heart of the Empire. The Lenin Mausoleum sits on Red Square like a geometric fact. Red granite and black Labrador arranged in lemon blocks. For 70 years, this cube was the absolute center of Soviet power. Every parade, every celebration, every mass demonstration oriented itself around this structure. The leaders stood in its tribune. The people filed through its doors. Lenin lay inside, eternal. On holidays, May 1st, November 7th, Victory Day on May 9th. The Politburo world climbed the stairs to the tribune. From that platform, they watched hundreds of thousands march past, workers carrying paper flowers, athletes forming living pictures, tanks rumbling over Kablestaneshings, the ground, children on their father's shoulders, waving at the distant figures above. The moral organized all this energy into a single ritual. The individual dissolved into the mass. The mass confirmed its bond with power. On ordinary days, the queue formed before dawn. It snaked across Red Square in January blizzards and August heat. More than 70 million people made this pilgrimage over 70 years. The wait could last hours. The line moved slowly past Kremlin walls, past the changing off guard at the Sponsy gate. Finally, you descended from daylight into coldness. Guards stood motionless. No talking aloud, no photographs. Down polished granite stairs into the funeral chamber. There, in a crystal sarcophagus, designed by Konstantin Melnikov, lay Lenin. Reddish light illuminated his face and hands. Visitors filed past in continuous motion, forbidden to stop. The encounter lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then back up the stairs out into daylight, the spell broken. Leonid Krisen, who helped organize the preservation, proclaimed in 1924 that Moscow would become the new Mecca, the mausoleum, its holiest shrine. The architect, Alexei Shushev, was summoned in the middle of the night after Lenin died in January 1924. He later described the frantic construction. At -25, the earth was too hard for shovels and crowbars to make an impression. Explosives experts were needed. The construction workers were able to keep warm by sleeping in special military tents outfitted with stoves. The entire labor of building the mausoleum lasted another 3 days. The workmen only left Red Square at the moment when the military arrived to take part in the assembly. That first wooden structure was meant to be temporary, but the endless queue of mirrors convinced the leadership. Otherwise, a permanent tomb, requirement preservation. A secret laboratory was established. The Pedagogic Center for Biomedical. Hundreds of scientists worked on maintaining Lenin's body. They developed new formulas, new techniques. Every 18 months, the body was removed, re-embodied. The skin treated with chemicals, fat kept it supple and lifelike. This was modern science conquering death. The Bolsheviks had mocked the Orthodox Church for venerating saints' relics. Now they had their own incorruptible body preserved through chemistry rather than miracle. The historian Ernst Kantorowicz wrote A Both Kings to Bodies, the mortal flesh and the eternal symbol. Lenin's breathed corpse guaranteed the of the state he founded. Stalin joined him there from 1953 to Uno Nueva Seisuno. Then one night during December, Stalin's body was quietly removed and buried by the Kremlin wall. Lenin remained alone. After 1991, proposals emerged to finally bury him as Xi's family had wanted. But something held the country back. The mausoleum had become inseparable from Red Square itself. Today, the queue is gone. Summertime as during celebrations, they board up the mausoleum, hiding it behind plywood. Rock concerts happen on the square. Look. Line Goom Store, where people once queued for basic. The red cube remains neither fully honored nor abandoned. The scientists still maintain Lenin's body, though the state that created him has vanished. Every few years, Samionet proposes moving him. Every few years, nothing happens. He lies there still, in his crystal case, in his geometric tomb, while above him the new usher tries to decide what to do with its most perfectly preserved relic.